The sound of battle in Europe had a rhythm all its own. Mortar thumps, the crack of rifles, the concussive roar of artillery. But to many American infantrymen, one sound stood apart, seared into memory: the ripping snarl of the German MG42. Its staccato bursts were so fast that individual shots blurred into one continuous tearing noise. Allied soldiers gave it grim nicknames: Hitler's buzzsaw, Hitler's zipper, a sound that froze men to the ground and echoed in their nightmares long after. The weapon was more than frightening. It embodied German doctrine. Where American squads were built around riflemen, German infantry revolved around their machine gun. Riflemen were there to carry ammunition, protect the gunners, and ensure the MG42 kept firing. It was the squad's anchor, its killing power, its backbone. For the Americans advancing through Normandy in June 1944, this posed an immediate lethal problem. Platoons moving across open fields often found themselves pinned under the sizing fire of just a few German machine gun crews. Entire companies could be delayed for hours by interlocking fields of MG42 fire. Casualties mounted quickly whenever infantry tried to rush without support. Yet what the Americans discovered as the campaign wore on was that reputation did not always match battlefield reality. Terrifying as the MG42 was, it had weaknesses: barrels that overheated quickly, prodigious ammunition requirements, and a weight that made relocation slow under fire. And against it, the U.S. Army fielded a weapon that at first seemed unimpressive, but in the grind of attrition proved decisive: the M1919A6 light machine gun. The 1919 lineage stretched back to World War I, derived from John Browning's water-cooled M1917. By 1943, U.S. ordnance officers sought to adapt the reliable but cumbersome M1919A4 into something portable enough for infantry maneuver. The result was the A6, fitted with a shoulder stock, bipod, and lighter barrel jacket. At nearly 32 pounds, it was hardly light compared to the Browning automatic rifle, but it gave American platoons a sustained fire weapon that could be carried forward with the assault. Side by side, the MG42 and M1919A6 represented two different philosophies of war. The German gun fired between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, nearly double the rate of most Allied weapons. The American gun, by contrast, fired at a steady 400 to 600 rounds per minute. German engineers pursued shock and terror. American designers pursued control and durability. The first clashes between these weapons came in the hedgerows of Normandy. Reports from the 1st Infantry Division noted that MG42 fire came in such dense curtains it seemed impossible to cross. But counter-reports from the same units emphasized that once M1919A6s were brought up, the equation changed. A section firing from cover could keep German gunners' heads down long enough for riflemen to flank. Suppressive fire was not about sound, but about persistence, and the A6 could persist. Even German soldiers recognized the shift. Post-war interrogations recorded that many Wehrmacht officers feared American firepower, not because of a single weapon, but because the Americans never seemed to run out of it. Ammunition, barrels, replacement parts. Where the MG42 consumed resources, the M1919A6 thrived on abundance. By late 1944, the terrifying buzz of the MG42 had met its match. In fields, forests, and ruined towns, German machine gunners found themselves locked in duels not of seconds, but of minutes. Fights decided not by sheer speed, but by who could keep firing when the barrels glowed red and belts ran dry. More often than not, that side was American. The myth of the buzzsaw endured, but the reality of sustained fire belonged to the M1919A6. The M1919A6 did not appear overnight. Its lineage was long, rooted in the industrial battlefields of the First World War. In 1917, John Moses Browning designed a heavy, water-cooled machine gun the M1917, that poured fire across no man's land in France. When the war ended, the U.S. Army sought a lighter, air-cooled version for vehicle mounts and infantry support. This became the M1919, a gun that would serve in different forms for half a century. By 1942, however, the American infantry squad faced a dilemma. The standard M1919A6, mounted on a tripod, delivered reliable sustained fire, but it was too cumbersome for maneuver. It required a crew to haul the weapon, its mount, and belts of ammunition. What the U.S. Army wanted was something portable enough to accompany riflemen in the attack, yet capable of providing the long bursts needed to suppress an enemy position. The answer came with the M1919A6. Engineers modified the existing A4 with a bipod, a wooden buttstock, a conical flash hider, and a carrying handle. These seemingly minor additions changed its role dramatically. No longer tied to a tripod, the A6 could be carried forward like a squad support weapon. At just over 32 pounds, it was not truly light in the way soldiers would later expect from modern machine guns, but it was mobile enough to follow the pace of the infantry. On the German side, the MG42 was the culmination of years of doctrinal emphasis on automatic fire. Designed by the firm Metall- und Lackierfabrik Johannes Grossfuss in 1942, it was meant to be cheap, easy to mass-produce, and devastating on the battlefield. Its roller-locked mechanism allowed for astonishing rates of fire, often 1,200 rounds per minute or more. German doctrine envisioned every squad as a machine gun nest on the move, with the riflemen serving the weapon rather than the other way around. The contrast was stark. Where the MG42 emphasized speed, the M1919A6 emphasized steadiness. American ordnance officers understood that battles were not won by the first 5 seconds of fire, but by who could keep firing 5 minutes later. With a cyclic rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute, the A6 consumed less ammunition, generated less heat, and required fewer barrel changes. It was a weapon designed for sustained engagement of time under fire. In practice, German gunners often carried 2 or 3 barrels at most. After a few long bursts, the gun risked overheating, forcing a pause. The M1919A6, with its slower rate and heavier barrel, could fire longer before such problems arose. Weight was another factor. The MG42 weighed just under 26 pounds with its bipod, lighter than the A6. But the true burden was not the gun itself, it was the ammunition. At 1,200 rounds per minute, belts disappeared almost instantly. A 2-man crew required additional riflemen to haul boxes of 250-round belts. By contrast, an American squad armed with a single A6 could carry its ammunition more sustainably, since the slower cyclic rate meant every belt lasted longer. U.S. training reflected these realities. Manuals emphasized controlled bursts of 6 to 8 rounds, discipline in trigger pulls, and coordination with rifle fire. The goal was not to overwhelm with sound, but to pin down the enemy long enough for flanking maneuvers. Doctrine and design worked hand in hand. By 1943, the M1919A6 was ready for the European theater. It was not glamorous. It lacked the psychological terror of the MG42's snarl, yet it was dependable, accurate, and perfectly suited for an army that could rely on limitless industrial support. 2 philosophies of firepower had now been set against one another. One was speed and fear, the other was endurance and control. In the battles to come, the difference would prove decisive. In war, weapons matter, but how armies use them matters more. Nowhere was this clearer than in the doctrines that shaped how German and American machine gunners fought. For the Wehrmacht, the machine gun was not a support weapon, it was the squad. German infantry doctrine, refined after the bitter lessons of World War I, centered on the idea of the MG Gruppe, the machine gun group. A single MG34 or MG42 was positioned as the nucleus of every squad. Riflemen were expected to carry ammunition, spot targets, and defend the gun crew. The gunner and assistant gunner were the key men. The rest were essentially a supporting cast. Suppression by the machine gun enabled maneuver by higher echelons, but at the squad level, everything revolved around keeping the weapon firing. This philosophy produced frightening results. An MG42 firing from cover could dominate open ground, its interlocking fields of fire creating killing zones. 2 or 3 crews working together could hold up entire companies, but it also meant German squads were predictable. Neutralize the machine gun, and the squad's backbone snapped. American doctrine was different. The U.S. Army had long emphasized the rifleman as the foundation of infantry. The semi-automatic M1 Garand gave every soldier considerable individual firepower. The Browning automatic rifle provided automatic fire within the squad, but the real base of fire came from platoon and company support weapons. In this structure, the M1919A6 slotted in as a flexible light machine gun. It could be attached to rifle squads during an assault or serve as part of a weapons section to lay down covering fire. Unlike German doctrine, the machine gun was not the centerpiece. It was one of several overlapping tools.
This difference shaped how the two weapons met in combat. German squads often deployed their MG42 immediately, seeking to pin the enemy with volume of fire. U.S. units responded by dispersing, identifying the gun's position, and bringing forward their own automatic weapons. A well-sighted M1919A6, firing in disciplined bursts, could force the German crew to pause, break cover, or relocate. Once the MG42 was under pressure, riflemen and bar gunners closed in to finish the fight. Crew organization also differed. A German MG42 team was typically 2 men, the gunner and his loader, supported by riflemen acting as ammunition carriers. A U.S. M1919A6 team usually had a gunner and assistant gunner as well, but its ammo supply was drawn from the squad or section without reorganizing the entire formation. This meant American units were more flexible. If a gunner went down, another soldier could step in with minimal disruption. Logistics made the contrast even sharper. A German MG42 firing at 1,200 rounds per minute devoured ammunition at a staggering rate. Even with discipline, belts emptied fast. In prolonged engagements, German squads often ran dry unless resupplied promptly. The M1919A6, firing at roughly half the speed, consumed ammunition more sustainably. On a battlefield where American supply lines kept trucks and jeeps constantly delivering fresh belts, this advantage only grew. Doctrine shaped perception as well. American manuals warned soldiers not to be intimidated by the MG42's sound. "The bark is worse than the bite," one pamphlet read. By comparison, German manuals acknowledged the durability of U.S. weapons, noting that while the MG42 could dominate short firefights, Americans excelled in drawn-out duels. In practice, when doctrine met doctrine, the difference often came down to endurance. The MG42 opened with a roar, terrifying in its intensity. But if the M1919A6 survived those first bursts, it could hold the field longer. Over hours and days of combat, the Americans' emphasis on sustained fire and flexibility proved more effective than speed alone. The Battle of Doctrines was underway. Soon, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of Belgium, it would be tested in blood. Normandy, June 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history had delivered American, British, and Canadian troops onto the beaches of France. For the U.S. infantrymen pushing inland, there was little time to marvel at the scope of the operation. The hedgerows awaited. The bocage country of Normandy was unlike anything most Americans had seen. Dense earthen banks, covered in thick vegetation, turned every field into a fortress. German defenders made full use of it. Machine gun teams set up behind narrow gaps, waiting for the moment that riflemen emerged from cover. When the ambush was sprung, the ripping snarl of the MG42 cut across the hedgerows. To many soldiers, it was the most terrifying sound of the war. Reports from the 29th Infantry Division in June noted that the opening bursts of enemy machine guns seemed continuous, as though a single blade of sound. Men dove for cover, pinned by interlocking fields of fire. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes measured in yards.
Per day. For German gunners, the doctrine worked. The MG42 anchored the defense, forcing Americans to expose themselves. But as the battle wore on, a new rhythm emerged. U.S. platoons learned to bring up their own machine guns quickly, deploying the M1919A6 not as a static weapon, but as a counterweight to the buzzsaw. A single A6 crew could fire from behind a hedgerow, laying down bursts that forced German gunners to pause or relocate. Once the MG42 was under suppressive fire, rifle squads could maneuver around the flank. After-action reports from the 1st Infantry Division described one such engagement near Khamung. A German MG42 opened up from a concealed hedgerow, pinning down a rifle squad. The Americans responded by rushing a machine gun team forward. The M1919A6, set on its bipod, began firing steady bursts across the field. Once the American gun engaged, the German fire slackened, the report noted. This permitted movement by elements on the right who succeeded in forcing the enemy to withdraw. Survivor accounts emphasized not just the firepower, but the psychology. The MG42's opening roar inspired fear, but when American machine gun crews answered with disciplined fire, morale steadied. One sergeant later recalled, "The first time you hear that German gun, you think nothing can live under it. Then our Brownings start up and you realize we can match them shot for shot." Normandy also highlighted the practical differences between the two designs. German gunners struggled with overheating barrels and prolonged exchanges. Without adequate resupply, their belts of 7.92mm ammunition dwindled quickly. The M1919A6, though heavier and slower, rarely suffered stoppages under the same conditions. U.S. forces, with constant truck and jeep deliveries, rarely ran short on ammunition. By July, the Americans had adapted. Tactical manuals circulated in the field emphasized suppressive fire and coordination. Keep MG42 crews engaged with A6 bursts while riflemen and BAR gunners maneuvered. Veterans learned to recognize the rhythm of the enemy's bursts. When the MG42 paused for a barrel change, U.S. troops surged forward. The hedgerows became laboratories of adaptation. Where early encounters ended with American squads pinned down, later battles saw growing confidence. German fire was still deadly, but no longer decisive. The M1919A6 had proven its worth as a portable base of fire, able to counter the feared buzzsaw. For the German machine gunners, the lesson was bitter. The MG42 was unmatched in shock value, but shock could not win prolonged battles. Against an enemy with more men, more ammunition, and more guns, the advantage slipped away. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the MG42's legend was forged, but so too was the reputation of the M1919A6. The MG42 was a marvel of engineering, cheap to produce by German standards, designed with stamped parts rather than costly machined components. Yet even so, German industry could not build enough of them to keep pace with losses. By 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had crippled armament factories, disrupting production schedules and forcing desperate substitutions. Entire divisions often went into battle with a mix of MG34s and MG42s, and sometimes with fewer machine guns than doctrine required. The American story was the opposite. By 1943, the United States had embraced total industrial mobilization. Lockheed, Ford, General Motors, and scores of subcontractors churned out weapons and ammunition at a scale unprecedented in history. Over 400,000 M1919 series machine guns rolled off assembly lines, thousands modified into the A6 pattern for infantry use. Ammunition production was even more staggering. Belted 30-caliber rounds filled crates stacked in warehouses, loaded onto Liberty ships, and shipped across the Atlantic in a continuous stream. Numbers mattered. A German infantry company might deploy half a dozen MG42s, each with a pair of barrels and a limited supply of belts. An American infantry company, by contrast, not only had multiple M1919A6s, but also the bars, guerans, and mortars that supported them. Firepower was distributed widely across the formation, not concentrated in a few critical guns. The loss of a single MG42 crippled the German squad. The loss of a single A6 was inconvenient, but not decisive. Sustainment made the difference sharper still. German crews frequently reported running out of ammunition in prolonged firefights, their belts consumed in minutes of high-rate fire. Replenishment was difficult, with horse-drawn carts or limited truck convoys struggling to keep up with retreating or encircled units. In contrast, American platoons routinely carried thousands of rounds, and when they ran low, jeeps or half-tracks delivered more within hours. In the hedgerows of Normandy and later in the forests of Belgium, American gunners discovered they could simply outlast their German counterparts. After-action reports highlight this endurance. One U.S. officer in the 4th Infantry Division described a machine gun duel during Operation Cobra. The enemy's initial bursts were heavy, rapid, and effective, but within 5 minutes, his fire slackened. Our own gun, firing steadily, continued until his position was reduced. This pattern repeated again and again. Shock value favored the MG42, but staying power favored the M1919A6. Production also reflected philosophy. The MG42's blistering rate of fire was technically impressive, but logistically punishing. At 1,200 rounds per minute, it devoured belts and burned out barrels at an alarming rate. Even with disciplined short bursts, ammunition demands were immense. The M1919A6, by contrast, was designed for endurance. Its moderate rate of fire consumed ammunition at a sustainable pace, while its heavier barrel tolerated longer engagements without damage. The American supply system, built on abundance, turned this design into a battlefield edge.
By autumn 1944, the imbalance was obvious. German units retreating from France often abandoned their guns for lack of ammunition. American units advanced with stockpiles so large that they occasionally burned excess ammunition in training just to lighten their loads. The scale of U.S. production, married to the steady reliability of the M1919A6, ensured that American machine gunners could keep fighting long after their adversaries fell silent. The duel between the MG42 and the M1919A6 was not decided in the first seconds of fire. It was decided in the long hours of sustained combat, where numbers, logistics, and endurance tipped the balance. In that contest, the Americans held the winning hand. The MG42's most famous trait was its terrifying rate of fire, over 1,200 rounds per minute in ideal conditions. Allied soldiers often described it as the buzzsaw, its mechanical roar unlike any other weapon on the battlefield. German doctrine celebrated this speed as the heart of squad tactics, turning a handful of men into a force capable of halting entire platoons. Yet the very feature that made the MG42 so feared also created its limitations. Suppression is not about raw speed alone. It is about maintaining a steady, credible stream of fire that keeps enemy heads down while maneuver elements advance. In this respect, the M1919A6 revealed advantages often overlooked in wartime propaganda. American gunners trained to fire in controlled bursts, 6 to 9 rounds at a time, rather than long streams. At 400 to 600 rounds per minute, the A6 could keep firing for minutes on end without exhausting its belt or overheating its barrel. In practice, this meant American units could sustain suppression across the entire length of a firefight, while MG42 crews often had to pause, change barrels, or conserve ammunition after the first furious volleys. The result was a distinct psychological effect. German bursts were shocking but brief. American fire was less dramatic but more persistent. Veterans in both armies remembered that distinction. One U.S. sergeant in the 29th Infantry Division recalled a firefight near St. Lo. The Kraut gun rattled like thunder. We hit the dirt fast, but after 30 seconds the noise stopped. Our own gun kept hammering, slower, steady. We moved when he went silent. Accuracy also played a role. At extreme rates of fire, even trained MG42 crews struggled to maintain precision. The weapon's recoil was manageable when firing short bursts, but in longer strings, the muzzle tended to climb, spreading rounds across a wider arc. For area suppression, this was acceptable. For pinning down a single window, trench, or machine gun nest, the M1919A6 often delivered more reliable results. Reports from the 13th Corps in late 1944 note that American gunners were more consistent in neutralizing specific targets than their German counterparts, attributing this to the M1919's controllable rate of fire. The technical balance came down to philosophy. The MG42 embodied the German idea of overwhelming shock power, fire so fast and frightening that it froze the enemy in place. The M1919A6 embodied the American idea of endurance, fire long enough that the enemy could not recover. Both approaches worked in short engagements, but as the war turned into a battle of attrition, the steady endurance of the American gun often proved more effective.
The barrel issue magnified this contrast. German manuals demanded that crews carry multiple spare barrels, swapping them every 250 rounds in heavy fire to prevent warping. Barrel changes could be executed quickly. Trained crews managed it in under 10 seconds, but it still created gaps in fire. American gunners, by contrast, could fire far longer before risking serious overheating. Even without a quick-change system, the heavier barrel of the M1919A6 withstood sustained engagements. This was more than a technical quirk. It reshaped battlefield dynamics. A German squad pinned down under American fire could expect no break in the rhythm. An American squad under German fire could often anticipate pauses. Combat diaries confirm this pattern. A German NCO of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote during the Normandy campaign, "Our machine guns scream and bite, but soon must breathe. The Americans grind on without pause. It wears us down." Suppression, then, was not a contest of speed, but of rhythm. The MG42's buzzsaw terrified Allied soldiers, but its bursts were like lightning strikes, sudden, violent, but fleeting. The M1919A6 was the rolling thunder that followed, the steady force that lasted as long as needed. By late 1944, American commanders had learned to exploit this reality. Infantry tactics emphasized patience under initial German fire, waiting for the inevitable lull. When the MG42 fell silent for a barrel change or belt reload, the M1919A6 would surge forward, its fire continuous and measured. The duel was not just of steel and ammunition, but of endurance and discipline. The duel between the MG42 and the M1919A6 was not confined to foxholes and hedgerows. Its echoes shaped the very strategies of the armies that wielded them, influencing how divisions fought, how supply chains were organized, and even how the war was remembered. The German army had entered the war with the machine gun as the cornerstone of its infantry doctrine. From Poland to Russia, squads were built around the MG34 and later the MG42. Riflemen served primarily as support, feeding ammunition, providing cover, and maneuvering under the machine gun's umbrella. This made sense in theory. One devastating weapon anchoring a unit, multiplying its firepower beyond numbers. But by 1944, in France and Italy, this doctrine began to show cracks.
The MG42's appetite for ammunition forced the Wehrmacht into an increasingly precarious logistical race. At peak fire rates, a single gun could burn through 1,200 rounds in just a few minutes. German supply lines, already strained by Allied bombing and fuel shortages, could not sustain such demands. Reports from Normandy detail units running low on belts within hours of an engagement, forcing them to ration firepower that was supposed to be overwhelming. The Americans approached machine guns differently. Their squad was rifle-centric, built around the M1 Garand. The M1919A6 was heavy and less mobile, but it served as a supporting arm rather than the squad's centerpiece. In U.S. doctrine, the machine gun supplemented the M1 rifle.
Riflemen instead of overshadowing them. This gave the squad flexibility. If the A6 jammed, overheated, or lagged behind, the riflemen could still carry the fight forward. Strategically, this difference mattered. The Wehrmacht, reliant on its machine guns, suffered badly when crews were killed or belts ran out. The Americans, with their broader base of firepower, could adapt. What German planners envisioned as decisive base of fire often turned into isolated outbursts, followed by silence when the logistics caught up. Meanwhile, American units leaned on the slow, steady beat of the A6 to grind forward hour after hour. Another dimension was morale. The MG42 terrified Allied soldiers, but its high consumption rate meant its shock was often fleeting. U.S. intelligence noted that units quickly learned to ride out the initial bursts, waiting for reloads or barrel changes. In contrast, the M1919A6 wore down German units gradually. German soldiers spoke of the dread of being under continuous fire, unable to time a safe moment to move. At the operational level, these differences rippled outward. In Normandy, Allied commanders observed that German machine gun nests slowed advances but rarely stopped them. Each nest consumed enormous amounts of ammunition, and once suppressed, it often left German infantry exposed with little support. By autumn 1944, the German reliance on belt-fed firepower had become a liability rather than a strength. The U.S. Army, by contrast, could sustain its firepower. The American logistical machine was unmatched. Liberty ships, Red Ball Express convoys, and well-stocked depots kept ammunition flowing. A machine gun that used fewer rounds, fired more deliberately, and emphasized reliability fit this system perfectly. The M1919A6 may not have inspired fear like the MG42, but it was better suited to the industrial, attritional warfare that defined the late war. Historians often describe this as a clash of philosophies. The MG42 embodied Germany's search for tactical dominance through technical marvel, an engineering marvel that dazzled but devoured resources. The M1919A6 represented the American preference for balance, endurance, and integration into a larger system of firepower. One weapon sought to overwhelm, the other sought to sustain. In the end, the strategic impact was clear. The MG42 delayed but could not stop the tide. The M1919A6, less glamorous but more dependable, played its role in the relentless advance of the clash between the MG42 and the M1919A6 was more than a contest of calibers and rates of fire. It was a microcosm of the war itself, a battle between two industrial philosophies, two armies, and two visions of how modern conflict should be fought. On the battlefield, the MG42 became infamous. Its nickname, the Hitler's buzzsaw, captured the dread it inspired in Allied soldiers. Its blistering rate of fire gave German squads immense striking power in the opening moments of combat. Yet the very qualities that made it fearsome also exposed its limits. It consumed ammunition at an unsustainable pace. It demanded disciplined crews, constant barrel changes, and heavy logistical support. In the resource-starved later years of the Reich, these demands could rarely be met.
The M1919A6, by contrast, never dazzled with spectacle. It was not the subject of propaganda reels or whispered with terror and foxholes. Its sound was measured, its rate of fire deliberate. But its virtues lay in its balance, reliable under pressure, steady in prolonged engagements, and integrated into a squad system that relied on every soldier, not just the gun team. In grinding campaigns like Normandy, Hürtgen Forest, and the Ardennes, this balance proved decisive. Veterans on both sides remembered the weapons differently. For Americans, the MG42's sound was unforgettable, but so too was the relief of hearing their own guns answer back with a rhythm that never faltered. For Germans, the MG42 was both pride and burden, an unmatched weapon, but one that drained men and supplies. Many admitted after the war that the steady hammering of the M1919A6 was just as hard to endure as their own gun was to face. The legacy of these weapons extended far beyond 1945. The MG42's influence echoed through the designs of the post-war era. The West German Bundeswehr adopted the MG3, a direct descendant of the MG42, chambered in NATO 7.62 mm and still serving in the 21st century. Its design philosophy, light, belt-fed, general-purpose firepower, became the template for the modern general-purpose machine gun, GPMG. From the FN mag to the American M60, the DNA of the MG42 is unmistakable. The M1919A6 also left its mark, though in subtler ways. Its role as a squad support weapon foreshadowed the eventual U.S. move toward lighter, more mobile guns like the M60 and later the M249 SAW. Its reliability and integration into combined arms doctrine reinforced the American preference for weapons that fit into a broader logistical and tactical system rather than dominate it outright. In historical debates, the MG42 is often hailed as the better gun. From a technical standpoint, rate of fire, engineering sophistication, and sheer lethality, this is hard to contest. But history is not written by specifications alone. The M1919A6 was the better fit for the war America fought, a war of attrition, logistics, and sustained firepower. Where the MG42 sought to shock and overwhelm, the M1919A6 ensured that American squads could advance, survive, and prevail. Perhaps the truest measure of their legacy lies in the memories of the men who fought with and against them. One American veteran, looking back in the 1980s, summarized it this way: "The German gun scared us. Ours got us home." A German counterpart, reflecting on his MG42, called it a lion's roar in a starving army. Both statements capture the essence of these weapons, not just machines of steel and oil, but instruments that shaped human lives in moments of fear, courage, and endurance. In the end, the MG42 and M1919A6 remind us that weapons are never isolated. They are part of systems, of men, tactics, and supply chains. The MG42 showed what brilliance could achieve in bursts. The M1919A6 showed what persistence could accomplish over time. And in the crucible of World War II, persistence proved the stronger path to victory.